Hi, it's Kai, and this is Un-American. In Un-American, I invite international experts to share their perspectives on US-related issues and to add new angles to inherently American debates. Today, I'm talking to former police chief Devon Clunis about a Canadian take on police violence and police reform. Devon Clunis, welcome to the podcast.
I'm very happy to be here with you, Kai.
When I emailed you about this, I was thinking, how can I start talking about police violence in the US? And I thought, well, you could start with talking about George Floyd. You could start with talking about Breonna Taylor, Daunte Wright. And I think that would make sense because it's leading us right into the lives and the deaths of those people. And it makes police violence real. At the same time, I always feel when I hear debates about police violence starting with individual cases, it gets kind of bogged down, I feel like, in the details of that specific case.
Yeah.
So I want to start on a meta level. I want to start with the data. In Germany, where I'm from, since 2015, there have been 100 people killed by law enforcement. In your country, Canada, the police has killed 400 people since 2015. And in the same period of time, in the United States, 10,300 people have died at the hands of police officers. Just last year, more people have been killed in the US than have been killed by Canadian law enforcement over the past 20 years. Why is police violence in the US so much more prevalent than elsewhere?
Yeah, Kai, and we're going to have a very open, honest discussion. And again, I don't want anybody to think I'm defending police. I can say right away, when I hear the term police violence, it's not going to take away from the fact the stats you just talked about. But the term police violence always gets me kind of the wrong way. When you talk about violence, as we think about it in the respective criminal codes, unlawful acts, the number of deaths, unacceptable. But the answer isn't as simple as saying it's police violence. It's police in the actions, fulfilling their duties. Whether the actions are justified or not, I try to couch it in a different way than just saying police violence. You're not just going out indiscriminately doing these things, whether in your country, ours, or the US. But what I would like to say to that, it's very difficult to compare Germany, Canada, and the US, because culturally, we're quite different. We're socialized differently. Gun culture is different in each of our respective countries, and we have to respect that. So I do work both in Canada and the US. When I do work there, I never simply say you need to be the way that we are, because you're talking about centuries of history and the way that people are socialized, the culture. You don't change that overnight. And so for myself as a Canadian police officer, I recognize, yes, far fewer people die in the line of duty in Canadian policing than happens in American policing. But you also have to look at the fact that in the United States, you have a right to bear arms. It's not your right in Canada. So right from birth, we're socialized differently in relation to firearms and your freedom to possess them. And so that's a significant part of the conversation. As I said, it is not something that myself or you can go into the United States and say, thou shalt do, because we're talking about history and culture. And so for me, that will be the biggest difference, is that we're socialized and our cultures are different in relation to guns and your ability to possess them, have them in your homes.
Maybe we start by the US debate and by how I feel like law enforcement is rationalizing many of these incidents that we have started talking about. I feel like in rationalizing an incident like that, a fatal shooting or an injury caused by law enforcement, there happens to be this defense or this line of defense from US police representatives that is, we have to make split-second decisions. We are facing imminent danger, potentially life-threatening situations. That defense says things can go wrong in high-stakes situations, I guess. Now, I don't think that evidence always supports this, but I do want to stick with it because I do feel there's something in that line of defense. It's very telling in a way to me about the situation in the US, because what the argument says to me is we, the police, don't feel safe. We feel like we're in a constant state of danger when we are engaging with civilians, when we're engaging with the public. And that is quite telling. It's interesting to think that the defense of the police, which is there to ensure public safety, is that they're not feeling safe themselves, that they are feeling like things can go wrong anytime. They're expecting trouble, so to say. So as someone who's worked for the Canadian police, who's also trained police officers in the United States, do you feel like there's a fundamentally different relationship between the public and the police in the US than there's in Canada, for example?
I absolutely do. I feel that there is a distinct difference. So yes, I totally get when a U.S. police officer says that they show up and they're in fear. And legitimately, I believe it's legitimate. In my 29 years in policing, I only had to draw my gun in the line of duty twice. Once, I had an armed individual, and in that case, he dropped the weapon and he ran. On an average day, I can tell you most U.S. police officers are showing up to an incident when they know without a doubt there's likely a firearm, and they know that individuals in that situation aren't just going to drop it and run. So it's quite different, and that's why I never pass judgment on what occurs in the U.S. Go back to what I said earlier. It has to be at the socialization. Most of the time when I showed up at a home, I had no fear that there was a weapon there. And as I told you, in the case where a person does have a weapon, there was a sense of still a level of respect for the police. That's eroded over time. I think slowly we're starting to mimic more of what we see in the United States. But I do believe those officers are honestly acting, not every single one. I'm not defending. I'm just talking about looking objectively that most of the times when they show up, they have legitimate reason to be fearful for their well-being. I also look at the way that police officers are trained in the U.S. and how they're trained in Canada. Preservation of life definitely is a primary concern in terms of how we train our officers that, we want to do everything to keep yourself safe, but you also want to do everything you can to keep that individual that we're dealing with safe. I am not saying that we're perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and de-escalation was something that we were doing when I was a recruit 37 years ago. I know it's now becoming more prominent in the way that U.S. police officers are trained. I would say U.S. police is more of a warrior mentality, what you'll find in Canada. And the name of our organizations actually reflect that. We call ourselves the police service. With the mindset, we're here to serve the citizens in every way that we can. We went from being force to department to service. And that reflects how we're trained and the relationship that we try to have with the public that we serve. And again, let me stress, I am not saying that we're perfect because we're not, but it's about our culture, historically, what our culture is about and how we try to shift that culture.
It's an interesting point that I haven't thought about, police force versus the police service. Could you go into detail with what you just said? Because I find it very interesting that there's a difference in training and in serving the public that you have recognized between Canada and the US.
Here's a poignant example I have for you. I remember in one department I was working with in the US, and I went to the training academy, and the instructor brought over an individual that we're really very proud of. And I asked the individual, so why did you want to become a police officer? And the response was, I just really want to take it to the bad guys. Now, I can tell you in Canadian policing, as a recruit, in the interview process, if that's your response, that person would not be selected. And if that's your response during training, more than likely you will be filtered out. Because we don't want anyone coming in with the mindset that the public is their enemy, even the ones who we consider to be criminals. No, they're not your enemy. Your number one responsibility as a police officer is not to take it to the bad guys. Your number one responsibility is to create safety in the community. And that doesn't just mean law enforcement. Most of what we do in policing really isn't law enforcement anymore. And so we really want our recruits to recognize that it's about community building. So if somebody comes in with this warrior mentality, that's why you're going to have this type of response. You see everyone now as a threat to you, as opposed to somebody that might be in need that you need to assist. And again, I am not saying that we're perfect, but foundationally, that is how we see policing. I think that transition is also coming to places in the US, but historically, it hasn't been that way. Historically, it wasn't always that way in Canada, but over the last number of decades, that shift has taken place where it's very community-centric. It's about building community. It's not so much about law enforcement. That's a significant, distinct difference.
The point that you made earlier about guns, I feel like when we talk about the relationship between the police and the public in the US, you cannot ignore gun ownership. I feel like it's not often discussed in the debate. It's always about individual incidents, why they happen, but gun ownership is kind of taken for granted. Still, the United States has the most heavily armed civilian population in the world by far. For every 100 residents in the US, there are around 120 firearms in circulation in the US. What do you think the psychological effect of that is?
I say this very sincerely. I think that creates almost a sense of constant PTSD within not only policing, but in the populace. Imagine that you're operating in this constant state of hypersensitivity, hyper awareness. I mean, for example, when I cross the border into the US, I'm on the highway and I imagine that every single vehicle I'm passing, there's likely a firearm there. That's as a civilian. Never mind now as a police officer when you're going to an incident. I'll drive from coast to coast across our country in Canada. That thought never crosses my mind. So I go back to what I said earlier. It is about culture. And so it's very difficult for me to sit on the outside and critique or criticize, because if I was, daily living and growing up in a culture like that, and I'll become a police officer and realize that now, that constant hypersensitivity to what's going on in my environment is now even more heightened because I'm the law enforcement officer, and at any point, whether I can see or not see, there could be a firearm. I think it creates that constant sense of fear. So when you do show up, you may be more sensitive. You may maybe react too quickly sometimes because you have to. It's self-preservation. It is about a deep cultural piece that neither you or I, Kai, in this short discussion or in the next decade or two will be able to resolve. It's something that people will have to grapple with. But I totally understand and appreciate when a police officer shows up that they're hypersensitive to what could happen. I mean, they want to go home to their families as well. And so I do absolutely get that.
Is there things in training that you can do about that? Is there things that you are talking to American police officers about when it comes to preparing for situations like that?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. And as I said, when we're trying to resolve some of these long historical, cultural issues, we try to point the finger, okay, can we do this one thing? And yes, I often say you can train police officers as much as you want. They could be the best police officers in the world. But some of that change also has to take place in a society. Because the last thing I would want to say to a police officer in the United States, okay, don't. And then all of a sudden, they're the ones who are ended up shot or seriously injured. I think it has to be a cultural shift, both within policing and within the culture itself. It has to happen almost simultaneously, parallel. Because, like I said, that's the last thing I want to say. Okay, don't be hypersensitive, and then you put yourself in a situation where suddenly you're disadvantaged. So yes, I think the things are changing in terms of de-escalation training. All of that is happening. But I even say that to individuals on this side of the border. You might have a perfect policing culture, but if we don't shift the culture within society as well, there was a period of time where the police were the people and the people were the police. There was more harmony and unity between police and community. I think community expectations have shifted over time, and to a large extent, police haven't shifted, in some regards. So we need to have, as I said, that parallel shift has to take place both within police and community. It has to be that shared responsibility.
Maybe a point to make here that shows me at least how far the police and how far the public have actually come apart in the US is what has happened to the American police force in the past, I would say maybe 20, 30 years. And that is a kind of politically sanctioned militarization, I would almost call it. So while it used to be the case back then that maybe military style rifles were reserved to special units, maybe SWAT teams that were used in high risk situations. Today in the US, almost the rank and file is equipped with guns like AR-15s, other long guns. In addition, since the 1990s, US police departments have, at times with the help of the Defense Department actually, increasingly acquired other military-grade weapons, even grenade launchers, armored vehicles from the US Army. It seems to me that, and this is maybe not a very controversial point, that an arms race between law enforcement and the public is not really the greatest way of improving public safety in the US. If all the weapons you have are assault rifles and grenade launchers, then aren't you preparing for a war in a way? Are we still talking about law enforcement here?
Let me try to put an objective lens on this, because as I said, in the past, police and community were very much aligned. And there came a period of time when the police would show up to a scene and they would recognize they're fully outgunned, the bad guys, so to speak. had bigger, better, more deadly weapons than the police. And though the police are supposed to be able to protect society as a whole, I'm not defending the police. I'm trying to help us understand how we got to this place so maybe we can pull back from it. And so police recognized that they needed guns equal to what the bad guys had. So that's why you had SWAT teams. That's why they asked for these more military grade weapons, because what they were seeing in the community when they went to deal with an issue was this is what they were facing, and they had nothing to back themselves up with. So that's why we got to this place. So I'm saying, how do we pull back from it? Do we simply say to the police, well, no, you can't have these weapons to defend yourself and defend the public? Then they show up to a scene, and here's what would happen. People would say, well, you should have been better equipped to be able to deal with the situation, right? And so we, as I said, it needs to be a shift that's taken place in the community, because by and large, what we've seen in the past is the police have responded to what was occurring in the community. Not with the innocent citizens, hear me clearly, but when they show up to an event to deal with a critical incident and they're not able to now effectively resolve it, now you're being held accountable because you should have known. So how do we pull back from this? Simply saying police can't have these weapons or these tactics. And I'm not talking about a situation where it's used indiscriminately and inappropriately. So to have a real meaningful conversation, we have to look at, why did the police evolve to this place? They evolved in a response to what was happening in the environment. How do we pull ourselves back from that collectively? Maybe government has to say certain weapons shouldn't be available.
That would mean, though, that it would be sensible to talk about gun legislation. It would be sensible to talk about public safety and what the public can contribute, and not only what police reform within police departments can look like.
Correct. Because this has to be, as I said, it has to be a bridge and a two-way street communication. Truly, as I said, we're a service in Canada, police service. We're here to serve the public. So we need to be policing in a fashion that's approved by the populace. And that's what we try to do. But that requires real meaningful conversations. And right now, I think what's happening a great deal in society is that we're not having very meaningful conversation. It's only one particular point of view, whether it's the police or the communities, but we never move forward in that manner. We have to move forward collectively, and we have to sit and have a discussion like you and I are having. I hear your point, you hear my point, and we said, okay, is there a middle road? Is there a different approach? Because I think ideally we all want the same things. The police want to be safe. The community needs to be safe. And if the police are supposed to be providing that sense of safety and security, how do we do it in a fashion that the community fully approves of?
I feel like the point where this dialogue maybe between the public and the state, the police, derailed in the US is definitely the George Floyd protests, I would say. And how that debate around police violence caused people to not believe that the police is responsible when it comes to dealing with or making them more safe. In the US, studies suggest that Black Americans are killed by police at twice the rate of white Americans. I read University of Chicago data that says 24.9% of all persons killed by law enforcement are Black males, who in turn comprise only 6.1% of the total US population. Similarly, Hispanic Americans also killed at a disproportionate rate. I also think data sets like this aren't totally unique to the US. In Germany, police violence is disproportionately aimed at certain immigrant communities. If my research is correct, you in Canada could say the same about indigenous communities potentially.
Yes.
What's your best explanation for that?
So first, let me say clearly, I agree with you in terms of police violence. In the case of George Floyd, yes, that's exactly what that was. There was nothing legal about any of that, nothing sanctioned. So in that case, police violence does apply. And that's why I like for us to, properly apply that to the situations where it fully fits. Why do we find that, more minority individuals are involved in these incidents with police? I'll take us all the way back to days of slavery. How are we socialized? Black lives just didn't matter as much. In Canada, in the Canadian context, Indigenous lives. Displaced from their lands, the police were a big piece of that. When I do my work in the US, part of what I try to, bring up and point people to is to recognize that the historical roots of policing wasn't good for Black people, wasn't good for Indigenous peoples. It's primarily a means to keep people down. And so that's kind of in the DNA, and it's filtered in. It's shifting, but it hasn't shifted fully yet. And so typically, I don't always want to blame the current generation, but I try to help them to see you need to understand the history of where we're coming from and that those we're still having that residual effect and impact. And now we have a responsibility to help shift that. When you look at the conditions that a lot of Black and Indigenous people are living in, deeply socially challenged. And because of those social challenges, that's who the police are dealing with on a regular basis. And I think after a period of time, you know what? We're only human beings. Maybe some of that emotional and psychological fatigue just sets in. And you start no longer seeing people as people, you start seeing them as the problem. And we assign that to a certain group of people or individuals. That's what I think we're dealing with. And in order to be able to fully address that, I think we need to have those conversations here, helping people understand how we have been socialized, how institutions have been constructed, and that we now have a responsibility to work to dismantle a lot of that. But most of the times we just come up with the discussions about you're Black, I'm white, you're Indigenous, and it's a fight. And we never talk about how we got to this place. I know we can now collectively work together to create a better future for us all. That's the only reason I went into policing in the first place.
Would you say that there is in the background in Canada, for example, also in the US, from your experience, a discussion about this within the police force, within the police departments, about history, about the initial reason for why we have a police service, the initial history of how it came about and what's linked to it? I mean, you started all the way with slavery. Do you feel like that debate is only a public debate, or is that also a debate that is happening within police departments, or at least within people who are concerned with the police?
I can tell you in the Canadian context, that is a discussion that's been ongoing for a significant period of time. What we call reconciliation is ongoing in Canada in terms of the relationship with Indigenous peoples who first occupied this land. And so that is ongoing. Cultural awareness, anti-racism, cultural competency, those are things that have been within policing in Canada for a significant period of time, and ongoing training is still taking place. Again, I always want to stress, I'm not saying that we're there. I've worked on First Nations communities in the United States, and I can tell you those experiences left me feeling very fortunate to be in Canada, because I said, we're at least having the discussion, like it's in the public arena, in government. It's front and center in terms of reconciliation and what this history was like and what it's done to Indigenous peoples. That conversation is not happening to the same extent in the United States. And so in that regard, I think we're further down the road. I think the US can learn from Canada. You know, in the past, we would consistently be learning from the US in terms of policing and police tactics. But I think we're at a point now in history where there are some things that we can share and we can learn from one another.
I just want to drill down on what your exact position is when it comes to the issue of racism that we just talked about. Would you regard the police as an inherently racist organization? I think you've been making the point in the past that talking about systemic racism within the police isn't maybe that helpful, or it's a little bit too simplistic maybe, because that just leads down to this point of, well, are police officers really more racist than the general public, or is it just the racism of the general public being translated into the police force? I think that's an interesting debate to have. At the same time, though, I find it very interesting that given your track record of working with law enforcement and actually the positions you've worked in, very high-ranking positions, that you seem to share many of the positions that critics have leveled against the police. Could you give us a more concrete idea of where you stand on this issue and where your issues with the public debate maybe? Where are you diverging from the idea that the police is an inherently racist institution?
Yeah, so just to be clear, so I was a chief of police in our city, was one of the first Black officers hired in 1987. 2012, became chief of police. I was the inspector general of policing for the province of Ontario. I do work internationally in terms of policing. I went into policing because, you know, when I first arrived here in Canada in 1975, I didn't like what I saw on television. There were not a lot of Black people. My socialization in terms of what it meant to be Black in North America was what I saw on television, much of it coming from the US, and it was never very positive. So I decided I wanted to do something with my life to set an example for others that being Black is not necessarily associated with being bad, underprivileged, all that negativity. And I saw police and never saw Black officers. So I thought, hey, I have respect for the police. I'm going to join the police and show people that, again, you don't have to be the guy in the back of the cruiser car. I can tell you, as I started my policing career in the city, I received zero negativity within the police service in terms of being a Black individual. Every single promotion I ever applied for or received, as I told you, became chief of police. When I went to Ontario, and this was only in 2020, as the Inspector General, I found that Black people there were having a bit of a different experience than I had in Winnipeg. And so my challenge is this when we say the police institution is inherently racist. I've lived and worked in the Winnipeg Police Service, never experienced any racism. Are there racist police officers across our country and the US? Absolutely. But does that mean every single police officer is racist? So I never liked using those broad strokes of saying police is inherently racist. I didn't like when I was a young Black kid and, a Black person committed a crime and all people said was Black people are. So I have never wanted to just paint that brush. Yes, we know the history of policing, but I know every single recruit that I've worked with, none of them look like me. Many were they're white, in quotation marks. I would never say any of them are racist. That's never been my experience. Are they racist individuals? Yes. So let's point to the individuals, but I never like when we label an entire people or an organization as a racist institution because it's just not true. It isn't. And so I'll stand, I won't have to defend that. I'll speak my truth, my experience. And I think we have to be realistic. I always like to look at the social stratification of people. As you said, in the United States, a lot of Black people are living in those challenging environments, more constant interactions with people. I often wonder if we put any class of people in those social conditions, will we have a very similar outcome in that, yes, because the police have to interact with them more and it's always more challenging environments, would we have the same situation? And so rather than looking at these challenges for me simply from a point of its race, I say, is it because of socioeconomic? And if we try to actually lift people out of those situations, would we have a different result? I like to focus on that because, we arrived here in Winnipeg, for example, and we were very poor. But my family was able to rise up out of that particular social stratification. Everyone's done very well. And so we can encourage people with that. I cannot change the color of my skin, but through education and all these other opportunities, certainly I can rise up and be a part of our society. I think a message like that is far more hopeful for all of us when we look at talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion than simply saying I'm being kept down because of an organization or because a certain group of people are out to keep me down.
I feel like in this debate, we're putting a lot of onus on the police force. We're also putting a lot of onus on the public. I think you can't deny that a big part of this is politics. And what you've seen in the US in the wake of the George Floyd protests was that there was actually a powerful push for police reform. There was the George Floyd Justice for Policing Act, which was aimed to prevent racial profiling and to limit unnecessary use of force. And that was actually approved by a Democrat-controlled House of Representatives in 2021. Later, though, in the midterms in 2022, Republicans criticized Biden for being too soft on law and order, and I feel like this is a very common story. They're campaigning on the issue of law and order in politics. Biden kind of turned around after that and promised more funding for the police instead of less funding, more personnel for the police instead of less personnel. In the meantime, 23 was the most violent year when it comes to homicides committed by law enforcement for more than a decade, I think. Do you feel that the political toolbox for dealing with policing and public safety is terribly limited?
Yeah, no, I think you're right in that. I often look at the policing model in the US and Canada, and I say, this is what we have in Canada, which again is quite distinct from the US. Most of our police services operate under the governance of a civilian-led police board. So we're accountable to the police board, made up of individual private citizens. We have special investigation units. So anytime, a police officer kills somebody in the line of duty or somebody's seriously injured, an external entity now investigates that. So that's another level of accountability. In Ontario, the Inspectorate of Policing, which again is the first of its kind in our country that we're able to help establish, that brings in a level of a layer of the pursuit of excellence in terms of policing, your policies, your procedures, all of those things. And so we have several different layers of accountability for police officers in Canada. I don't see the same parallel in the US. And again, as I said, that's something I think that we can share with our counterparts in the US, that they can learn from Canada as much as we have learned from them. With that level, again, that responsibility and accountability to the public, and let me reframe that, I'm not saying that we're perfect, but these are all mechanisms moving in the right direction to kind of keep that relationship rebuild a bridge, even in terms of how we train our police officers, all public safety personnel. That's under a big review and evolution right now, focusing a lot on those other skills that we talked about that will hopefully prevent the incidents that we're talking about here today. That we need to reframe the way that we train officers, and that's going to be a significant shift in policing in our country as well.
I feel like in this debate, you've in the past mentioned the issue of overburdening. And to quote you, you feel that too often law enforcement is used to make up for political failure. Could you explain that in more detail?
Well, absolutely. You know what? When you look at some of the real critical incidents, for example, protests, let's say I'll use a Canadian example, protest over land rights with Indigenous peoples. In the US, you can go back to the civil rights movements, where police was used to really just malign so many individuals. In the Canadian context, in terms of Indigenous communities protesting their land rights, I say to police in our country, no, we shouldn't just go in and say we're going to remove people. That is their right. And that's a political issue that needs to be resolved politically, as opposed to simply using the police as an arm of government. We've done that too much in the past. And I said very clearly now when I speak to police leaders, not that we need to be political, but we need to stand up for what is right. And these issues are significant and they're what's right. And so the police need now to be able to say, okay, all that's on the book doesn't mean that it's ethical. So what's their ethical responsibility? Yes, it's maybe legal, but is it right? And is it ethical? So if people are, peacefully protesting their rights, should we now just as a police go in and say, because somebody says, thou shalt, we're going to remove? I think we have to start thinking, not necessarily politically, but more ethically about how we operate within the environment.
Do you feel like the police is used for actions that they shouldn't be performing in a way in the US and also in Canada? I feel like a lot of these incidents have happened coming out of wellness checks, for example, have come out of incidents where you could actually debate whether the police should be the ones knocking on your door. Is that something you would criticize?
That's an easy one for me to respond to, because I honestly believe that's where I'm talking the royal we, have failed in society. There's a lot more people in need of mental health, mental care. It's not being provided. And who do you call? The police. And so they show up ill-prepared to deal with a very difficult situation, and they use what they're provided with, and then they're blamed for that. I think we need to create different entities in community that are able to respond to these calls. We better triage them so we know what we're sending someone to. And if it turns out to be a situation that fully requires the police, yes, by all means. But in most of these cases, we don't need to be sending the police as their first resort. And it's simply because we've been lazy in society to say that we have a responsibility. We need to create different mechanisms. That's some of the conversation that we really need to have. The police should not be going to a call which is primarily somebody in medical crisis.
I want to get into what your own view of policing is, what police reform could look like to you, because you had a long active career as a law enforcement officer. You've been the chief of police of the Winnipeg Police Service. You served as Inspector General of Policing for the Ontario government, and you were also hired by the Canadian government to develop new public safety trainings. Based on that experience, what major changes would you propose if you were put in charge of reforming policing?
So the first major change I would propose is this. We need to start having conversations. It is not about Devon Clunis as the expert. So when I did my work, both as the chief of police, the inspector general, when I do consulting work, I meet and I speak with the community. I meet with police officers. And as I said, it's amazing. I will have a conversation with a group of citizens, and I'll have a conversation with a group of officers. And lo and behold, they want the same thing. And now it's easier to bring them together and realize you're not that far apart. So the first thing we need to do is actually start having civil, meaningful conversations, get the police and the community on the same page, and from there you construct the path forward. You don't have somebody like myself coming in and saying, because I've done all of this, I can tell you what you should do. What we're lacking or missing is just conversation and a mutual understanding and respect, and saying that we're on this journey together and let's move forward together, as opposed to having somebody else tell you, here's what you need to do for you. That's where it all starts. So that's the first thing I would do. When I took over as chief of police, we were a murder and crime capital of the country. I didn't simply come in and said, here's what we're going to do. I had community forums across the entire city, and I did the same thing with my membership. Well, we're on the same page. 4 years later, we were the model of policing. And so that's what's required. Bringing people together, getting them on the common path and moving forward together. For too long, we've been moving separately, just yelling at each other across the Great Divide. That's not working for any of us.
I feel like things that you're proposing, neighborhood forums, discussions with the public, those are ideas that stem from the approach of community policing. And that focuses on developing ties between law enforcement and citizens. Are there concrete examples from your own work that inspired you to think about the relationship between the community or the public and the police more, and that actually make you feel like that is an approach that's very worthwhile?
Well, the whole reason I went into policing in 1987 was because I saw that disconnect between the Black community and policing. I joined the police service. I was able to build those bridges. I saw the community interactions. I can tell you, when I became chief of police, I held those forums that you talked about. Many times I would be in the community and people would tell me this. And the first year, we no additional expenditure. So I always want to say that. We didn't spend any additional money on police, and every year I gave money back to the city. But I remember people would say to me consistently, Chief, we feel the difference. Sometimes we want the metrics, and it's really hard for you to measure a feeling. But when you consistently hear from your citizens, we feel the difference. And then you see the response from your officers who would keep coming forward with more ideas of how we can engage and things we can do, not about law enforcement, but just about building relationships with the community. That's a pretty concrete example. And if you want the ultimate example, you go back and you look at a 2016 Maclean's Magazine article written about the City of Winnipeg and police, and this is after I retired, and they said it looked like a minor miracle that occurred in our city in terms of the reduction in crime and the growth in community cohesion. I had university professors come and wanted to interview me to say, like, how did you do this? I didn't do anything magical. I just cared about people. It's about relationship building, recognizing that your police officers and your citizens need to be on the same page, and you brought them together and they move forward on a common path. It wasn't magical. It's just getting back to the basics of valuing and caring about people. And, we think it's got to be something, out of the box. This is just basic respect for one another and moving forward.
Would you feel like the basics that you just mentioned are missing in many places?
I absolutely believe the basics are missing, but it takes me back to what we said earlier. If you are patrolling and policing in an environment where you feel that you're under siege, it's going to be very difficult for you to do this. I did the simple things. Believe it or not, I actually went out and I modeled for my officers walking the beat, because they would walk the beat, but they wouldn't look at people. They wouldn't talk to people. I'm like, no, this is how you need to do it. You need to be the one to make the contact. So look people in the eye and smile and say, how are you doing? And I show them how to do it. And they're like, we see, right? Or I would say, just when you see kids out at the playground or at school, just park your vehicle, get out, and just go chat with them. Or just park, go to a mall and just walk around and talk to people. It's simple things like this, but hear me. Most of our officers today, and again, this is not a criticism of them, it's just understanding where we're at, because they're so busy. They get trained, got to protect yourself at all costs. They get into their cars, they go from one call to the next, to the next, to the next. And most of the calls they're going to, they're not very pleasant. You're not seeing the positive that society has. They're seeing just the negative. And after a while, that becomes your world. And so you're not having that time to build those bridges. The citizens see you driving by, not even smiling. Well, they think you don't like them. They're not smiling at you. You think they don't like you. And this dynamic just continues. And then when a critical incident happens, who do you think is feeling more compassionate or empathetic to the other? We haven't built that.
Would you say there's a way out of that dynamic anymore, especially in the US, though? Because what you've mentioned earlier is that you almost have the feeling that there's a sense of us against evil, us against the civilian population, more or less. Is there a way back from that?
I always believe there's a way back. That's why I'm still involved in this work. I'm retired, but I'm still heavily involved, not because I have to be, because I believe there's a path. And sometimes people simply need to be shown the path. I can tell you everything that we're talking about. When I meet my counterparts in the US and we sit down and we have a talk, they agree. If you want to look at a really good plan, I just finished working with the Madison Police Department, creating a strategic plan. But you'll see embedded in that plan things like not only the community forums, but ongoing community forums, one specific to youth, different marginalized communities, really ensuring that taking care of the membership is a high priority. We often miss out on that. We see police officers in their uniforms and we think, they're Autobots. No, they're impacted by all the things that we're talking about here as well. And so if we want to have that good relationship between police and the community, we have to ensure that internally they're in a very healthy environment. And so those are things that you'll see just embedded in there, building that really strong community relationship, strong care of your members. It's not really complicated, but most of us, we chase the crime and that's what we focus on, but we're missing the foundation that we need to build first so that we can do that in a very healthy way.
I was wondering in the things you've talked about so far, if in your approach to reforming the police, would there also be a defunding aspect in it? Because what I found really interesting reading up on your positions on this is that you actually were one of the very few, very experienced, high-ranking law enforcement officers who publicly said that defunding the police was actually something that they supported, or at least an idea that they shared in a way. And also, you've probably been one of the only police chiefs who's ever asked his higher up to cut his funding, I guess.
Yes. So as I told you, when I took over, we were murder and crime capital of the country. And, and throughout my time in the police service, what we would consistently do is give us more officers, more officers. I recognized it's not working. So I went to my premier and I said, no more money for us. I don't want any more money for policing. It's not working. But again, understanding the politics of it, I said, this will be a win for you. So I wanted, at the time, we had no crime analysts. I said, just give me money for 4 crime analysts. I want to make sure that we're doing the right things the right way. And the only way, as you said, is to have the data to back us up. So that's what we did. And the first year we had crime drop 13.9% in our city. No additional expenditures. And then I would say to my administration, because we would have, regular bi-weekly department heads meeting, and I'm sitting there and we had the largest sum of the city's budget. And I would look at people in social services and what they had. And I said, Curly, hey, cut my budget. I have no problems with that. But please put it into community services because they will actually help take a lot of the calls out of the queue. If we don't have these issues in community, you won't have as great a need for policing. They never did cut my budget, but every year, as I said, we came in under budget. We're able to give money back. So when I started hearing about the defund police movement, here's what I said. Hey, I agree with you. We don't want these escalating police budgets. But you can simply say today, I'm going to cut the police services budget until you've built the infrastructure in society to deal with all those calls that are not coming to the police. We talked about mental health calls. Significant portion now of policing. It's not a criminal matter. We need to create the right mechanisms in community to deal with that. And in time, you will see the need for policing decrease. So philosophically, I agree with that, but I say we have to do it intelligently. You can't do it because you simply want to get back at the police, right? All we're going to be doing is harming ourselves, and actually the most marginalized communities will be the ones most negatively impacted initially by this arbitrary defund police. Defund police intelligently over time by building up community.
Just to shortly get into that, do you think that these escalating police budgets, as you've called them, is that caused by very good lobbying by the police departments? Is that caused by a very simplistic approach, which we have talked about before, by politics to signal that they're doing something for law and order? Where do they come from, these budgets?
If you look at police culture, you see that it's be reflective or responsive to what's happening in the general culture. The only reason you can have escalating police budgets, right? The reason we need to grow to complement is because there's more calls coming to the police, there's more crime. Now, let's be honest, the police are not responsible for crime. They're responsible for responding to it. But in terms of reducing it, that's within the rest of society to deal with. The issues that are leading to crime, poor education, people who are on their house, all of those issues, social issues. I talked about the fact that in our city, if we want to reduce crime, we need to start looking at crime prevention through social development. That's not necessarily a policing issue. That happens years before the police are involved. If we just ensured, for example, that every child had the opportunity to go to a decent school, and then when they got home, parents who really don't know how to parent, that we provide parenting classes. I can tell you, when I had the community forums, the very first forum, single father stood up and said, we need parenting classes. I had other service providers who was able to offer that. Rather than providing all of these things ahead of time, as opposed to putting more money into policing, that's what we need to be doing. But nobody has the foresight to look beyond the 4-year cycle of elections to say, here's what we need to do for a generation or 10 years. That's how we defund police over the long term.
I do feel that many of the changes that you would be suggesting are of systemic nature, but I also think you've talked a lot about individual responsibility of people working in the police. Maybe it makes sense to bring it back to that individual level to close it off. Looking back on your career and I think 29 years you've worked in the police force, is there a specific piece of advice that you give to someone younger aspiring to become a police officer these days? Something that they can use in their everyday work to change the face of the police to the better, or as you would imagine it?
I would take it back to this, is that we go into policing to serve. I didn't go into policing to fight crime. As I told you, for me, it was a bridge building exercise. How could I build a bridge between police and people of color? You know, as I started to experience that, I would see people in real destitute conditions. How could I help them get out of those situations? And every now and then, yes, I had to enforce the law and we had to fight crime. But right from the get-go for me, it was about community building. And if we had police officers coming in with that mindset, or if we train them to recognize your primary goal is to build community. And yes, part of that might be the law enforcement component, fighting crime. But by and large, most of what you do is these relationships, these connections, and even some of those challenging people that you have to deal with, you can actually help them get out of the situation and become contributing members of society. If we teach people that, if they go into it with that mindset, I think we'll radically transform what we're seeing in terms of police and community relationships.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for taking the time. Much appreciated.